Good afternoon. This is Eduardo Mendieta. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Stony Brook, and it's truly a great pleasure and an honor to be here this afternoon with Noam Chomsky, who is probably one of the few American intellectuals who has been tracking U.S. intervention and foreign policy in Latin America. I read his work when I was a graduate student and an undergraduate student, and was involved in the CISPES and solidarity movements with El Salvador and Nicaragua. And it's truly amazing what you've done tracking the ways the United States has been intervening in Latin America. And I like to follow up in that direction, ask about Latin America. Right before 9/11, after the election, or we might call it something else, Bush and Vincente Fox were meeting to talk about some new policies, immigration policies that hopefully would alleviate circumstances for Mexican immigrants. Of course, after 9/11, these talks were abandoned and plans were, in fact, totally scrapped. And then early this year, Vincente Fox said no to the United States. What do you think is going to happen, the relations between the United States and Mexico?
It's a complex issue, and of course goes far back. I presume Mexicans haven't forgotten that the United States is sitting on half of Mexico. It's called the U.S. Southwest, which was stolen 150 years ago in a very ugly war. Since then, relations have been complicated. Mexico is just too independent for the U.S. Doesn't like it, and there have been efforts to deal with that. We go back. Mexico had had a significant period of economic development in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. It had a tremendous debt crisis in the early 80s, which is for complicated reasons. A large part of the Latin American debt crisis had to do with domestic U.S. financial policies. I mean, interest rates were zoomed to try to impose a certain domestic regime within the U.S. And since the debt is keyed to U.S. interest rates for all sorts of old imperial reasons, mm-hmm. the Latin American countries suddenly found themselves in a huge debt crisis. But it's kind of like it's not that they owed more money, it's just that the arrangements were changed. Mexico dealt with this under a lot of first they were going to default, and they dealt with it by instituting what are called reforms. Reforms is a word that means following IMF, World Bank orders. It's called the Washington Consensus, properly comes out of Washington, which is the whole array of neoliberal measures. And it followed those. And it was usual effects. I mean, wages went way down, the number of billionaires went way up, corruption went way up, privatization took place and enriched the corrupt and politically collected and wealthy. Didn't improve services, but that was the effect. In 1990 or 91, there was a important meeting at the public under the auspices of the Pentagon. It was called a Latin American Strategy Workshop or something like that, with lots of specialists in business and so on. And they concluded that U.S. relations with Mexico were fine, unimpeded by corruption and brutality and torture and so on and so forth, but good relations. However, they did see one cloud on the horizon, namely what they called a democracy opening. Mm. They said there might be a democracy opening in Mexico, which would open the way to a more independent policy. And that fear was understandable. The rule of the ruling party had been shattered. They'd only maintained control by a fraudulent election. Right. And it was clear that there could be a dreaded democracy opening. So what do you do if there's a threat of democracy opening that might lead Mexico to follow a more independent course reflecting its own population? Well, you have to tighten controls so that they won't be able to do it, even if they do have a democracy opening. And that means instituting the neoliberal programs more intensively. There's a name for that. It's called NAFTA.
Right.
NAFTA came out of that. And it was openly described, in elite circles at least, as a way to lock Mexico into the reforms, as they call them, lock them into these programs. So even if a democracy opening takes place, they won't be able to do anything about it, because the structure of the economic system will be so constrained by the Washington Consensus rules that they can't do anything about it. And that's pretty much what NAFTA did. It locked Mexico into this system. Now, going back to immigration.
Right, but didn't Vicente Fox come in precisely as someone perhaps trying to lessen the effects?
Yeah, trying, but then let's take a look at the immigration issue. Clinton is not a fool, he's a smart person. When NAFTA was implemented, something else was implemented along with it, Operation Gatekeeper. The Mexican border had been a very porous border. And it's like most borders, it's just the result of conquest. It's an artificial border. And pretty much the same people live on both sides, and they were going up and back. It wasn't very carefully controlled. But it was understood that NAFTA is probably going to cause what is called an economic miracle in Mexico, which means an economic catastrophe for much of the population. And there would be a flood of people trying to escape. So you had to institute Operation Gatekeeper, which militarized the border. So along with NAFTA came the first militarization of the border. And hundreds of Mexicans are killed every year. We don't know how many, by just trying to cross the border. And those went
Texas
along.
and taking shots at
I mean, that goes along with it. I mean, part of NAFTA, the so-called reforms, is making sure you cage the population in. NAFTA is not a free trade agreement, not the kind that Adam Smith would have talked about. Free trade means free movement of labor. Otherwise, you don't have anything like free trade. But it had to be controlled. So there's movement of capital, but no movement of labor. And that's critical if you want to construct a system in which the rights of concentrated capital dominate and the rights of people don't matter. In fact, even if you look at the regulations inside NAFTA, they're very explicit. So a U.S. company, say General Motors, can go to Mexico and demand what's called national treatment. They have to be treated like a Mexican company. But a Mexican of flesh and blood can't go to New York and demand national treatment. And we know what will happen to him. So these are proposals which certainly radically oppose any classical liberal conception of free economic systems and so on. They're designed to ensure the rights of concentrated capital, and the rights of people just don't matter that much. Well, what's happened in Mexico since NAFTA is that wages have declined about another 25% since NAFTA, which is an understatement, because in the informal economy, wages are estimated to have declined incomes by about 40%. And furthermore, more of the economy is becoming informal. So there's been a significant deterioration of living standards. The foreign investment in Mexico has increased, but total investment in Mexico has actually declined because a lot of Mexican business is being wiped out. They can't deal with international competition. So the fact is total investments declined. The wage and income levels for the majority of the population have declined. The worst hit is yet to come. It's when Mexico, I think that's what Vicente Fox is worried about, when they open up the country to free, they have had some U.S. agricultural imports, but if they open up it freely, there's hundreds of, huge number of Mexicans just are going to be driven off the land. What happens to them?
Well, already the corn market has been
devastated. Corn market's collapsed, and it's in the hand. A lot of Mexican entrepreneurs are doing fine, so they monopolize parts of the corn market, but in association with U.S. exporters. And the U.S. exporters have, again, nothing to do with the free market. This is highly subsidized agribusiness export, in which many costs are not even counted, like so-called externalities are huge. And the Mexican farmer can't compete with this, just like no one else can, including U.S. farmers either, who are also being driven out, small family farms and so on. But the effect of this is likely to spur an effort to escape. That means immigration barriers, and that's what's was waiting there. Now it's, if Mexico continues to subordinate itself to these policies, it's going to be in much more serious trouble.
It seems that before we had the Iraq as a petri dish for this new unilateral war, we were trying out neoliberalism in Latin America, and Argentina is a perfect example of that devastating. But also Brazil. Brazil is a ticking bomb.
It is. It's rather dramatic to see what's happening in Brazil. I mean, just take a look at a little longer stretch. 40 years ago, Brazil had a populist president, Goulart, nothing like Lula, you know, nowhere, not this. I mean, Lula's a very impressive person and has a huge popular base and so on. Goulart didn't, but he was kind of mildly populist. Well, Kennedy administration didn't like it. They organized a military coup, and he was overthrown. Happened a little after the assassination, but it was organized by the Kennedy administration. This was greeted with rapture by the Washington liberals. It was Kennedy's ambassador called it the greatest victory for freedom in the mid-20th century, or some name like that. The generals were praised for their wonderful democratizing achievements while they were torturing people and imposing a national security state, kind of neo-Nazi state. And that went on until it was finally, you know, they had made such a wreck of the economy, they finally left because let the civilians take it over in the 80s, same as happened in Chile. But for a long period, there was a military dictatorship, which had, you know, formal growth by some measures, but for the general population, it's misery, you know, tremendous poverty, some of the worst inequality in the world. It's a rich country. Right.
And the genocide against the Indians in the Amazon.
Just horrible. You know, out of this came very impressive popular movements, the most impressive in the world. The landless workers movement, which is from mid-80s roughly, became an extremely significant movement, taking over unused land, turning it into productive land for landless workers, cooperatives, you know, schools, and so on. It's enormous, hundreds of thousands of people. The Workers' Party, which grew out of similar things, came from industrial workers, agricultural workers, and so on. There were also, quite apart from this, rural unions being developed all over the place in very interesting ways. And in fact, a large part of the country is extremely organized. Well, they finally elected their own president. But notice there's no military coup, or even talk of it. Well, a number of reasons for that. One reason is the populations wouldn't tolerate it anymore, either here or in Brazil. It's not the 1960s. Another is they don't need it. They don't need it because of the neoliberal measures. The neoliberal measures are designed to prevent governments from following democratically supported policies. So and this is well understood. I mean, liberalization of capital, which is the first neoliberal measure from the early 70s, breaking down the earlier Bretton Woods system. If you allow capital to flow freely and you deregulate currencies, so you know they're no longer within a band, just opening the way to massive speculation. In fact, speculation just rose astronomically after that. And now with modern telecommunications, it's instant speculation, like second by second. And what it creates is what some economists call a virtual senate of investors and lenders who carry out what they call a moment-by-moment referendum on government policies. So if a government tries to institute, say, you know, health programs or something that's regarded as irrational, because it helps people, not profit. That's the definition of irrational. If you carry out an irrational program, the economy can be strangled by capital flight, by attacks on the currency, by other measures, and that's just what's happening. Lula is following Cardoso's policies.
Yeah. Can I ask you about Cardoso, which is a fascinating phenomenon? There you have a left economist, I mean, in many ways, a leader for the movements in the 60s and maybe even workers' movements in Brazil. And he was instrumental in implementing these policies. I mean, here's an economist of the left who understands very well Marx and understands the relationship between capital and flow of national capital. And he was the one that basically sold the country to...
I mean, and there were some achievements. Cut back inflation, which was a very serious problem, so that cut back. It left the country with a huge public debt, and this is it's kind of like a curse that they have to deal with somehow. I mean, the obvious way to deal with the debt would be to repudiate it. I mean,
and they couldn't do that.
Well,
Brazil.
To repudiate. I mean, the debt is an the debt is not an economic fact; it's an ideological fact. So, for example, take Iraq. Iraq has a huge debt. The United States is considering repudiating it.
Right.
Now, and they have a mechanism for doing that, a mechanism which, in fact, the U.S. invented, had to do with Cuba a century ago. It's the concept that's known in international law as odious debt.
Right.
So when the United States, what they call liberated Cuba, meaning prevented Cuba from liberating itself, which is what the invasion was in, Cuba was going to liberate itself from Spain. The U.S. intervened in 1898 to prevent that. It's called here the liberation of Cuba, meaning prevention of Cuban liberation. It was turned into essentially a colony. But when the U.S. took it over, they wanted to repudiate. They didn't want to take, Cuba had a big debt to Spain, and the U.S. didn't want to take that over. So they repudiated it and created the doctrine called odious debt, which is a plausible doctrine. It says if a debt is incurred under coercion, it's illegitimate. So like if, I borrow money from you because you have a gun to my head, that's not a legitimate debt. So, and they pointed out correctly that the Cuban debt to Spain was a colonial relationship, and it was accepted by Cuba under coercion. In fact, not by the Cubans, by a small Cuban elite. The Cuban people didn't ask for the debt, had nothing to do with it. So a small Cuban elite connected to the ruling imperial country incurred a debt for their own interests. As far as the population is concerned, it's a gun to their head. And this is odious debt, so the U.S. repudiated it. Did the same in the Philippines. The U.S. took over the Philippines shortly after and also repudiated the debts owed by the Philippines to the Spanish railways and all this sort of thing. That concept, actually the U.S. had done the same when it threw out the British during the Revolutionary War. Simply confiscated the British possessions, didn't pay them for them. This is what the powerful do. The concept of odious debt continued. So there was a case, I think it was Costa Rica versus England. The Costa Rica, didn't want to pay some debt to Canada or someone, and England was the responsible authority. This went to arbitration, international arbitration. Arbitration was by the William Howard Taft, the Chief Supreme Court Justice, and he granted Costa Rica's right to repudiate the debt on grounds that it was odious debt. Well, the whole third world debt is odious debt. I mean, it's the people of Mexico never incurred the debt. This is Mexico, and the same everywhere.
Cedillo is right now teaching it at Yale, and he is being, prosecuted in Mexico for stealing this money that was borrowed.
It's not even stealing. I mean, the whole debt is it is not, take the Brazilian debt. I mean, Brazilian workers and peasants didn't ask for the debt. They didn't borrow it. It was borrowed by the Brazilian rich for their own purposes. So under the concept of odious debt, which the powerful use when they feel like it, like the U.S. will probably use it in Iraq, the whole third world debt would disappear. Actually, there's an even simpler way to eliminate the debt. I mean, suppose you lend me money, okay, and I go out and buy a Mercedes, and then you come back and you ask me to pay you the money. I say, I'm sorry, I bought a Mercedes, I don't have the money. Why don't you get my neighbors to pay it? That's not the way it's supposed to work in a capitalist economy, but that's the way it works in the international economy. So when a country is in debt, meaning its rich have borrowed money for their own purposes and spent it to buy fancy apartments in Europe or commodities for themselves and so on, and then the lenders come back and say, pay me. The rich say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to pay you. Get the peasants to pay it. That's called structural adjustment. Meanwhile, the lender, if you're the lender, under capitalist principles, you're not supposed to say, well, okay, he's not paying me back, so my neighbors have to pay me back. You're not supposed to do that either. But that's what the IMF is. The IMF is an insurance company for lenders. If a debt doesn't get paid back, the debt is paid back by poor people who didn't borrow the money in the first place, not by the rich. They don't pay it back. And if the debt isn't paid back, northern taxpayers pay it back. That's what the IMF is. It's free risk insurance. The whole thing is a scam. The whole thing is an ideological scam from beginning to end, but it's a stranglehold. Now, going back to Brazil, Lula would be completely justified, the Brazilian Workers' Party, in simply repudiating the debt, or else saying, okay, let's use the capitalist principle. You rich guys lent the money to these rich guys here, get it back from them. We didn't borrow it. It's theirs. It's up to them to pay it back. But the point is to do that would be virtually revolutionary,
right.
And that would require, enormous public support, not only in Brazil but in the region, and support from the north.
In fact, when Lula was being inaugurated as president, he had Castro and Chavez, and I think Toledo from Peru was there, and they were talking about an axis of good, an axis of good for Latin America. And
it should start with debt repudiation.
Do you think that they might be able to form?
It's very tough. First they got to work together, and they don't. Mm-hmm. There's just too many things dividing them from one another: foreign power, domestic power, the international markets, and so on. So to do it is, theoretically you can do it, but it requires a level of popular mobilization and support and commitment at an international level, which probably doesn't exist. I think maybe the beginnings of it are coming into being, like the World Social Forum is the beginning of an international solidarity movement that might make it possible for countries in the future to do this. This really can't be done without support from the rich northern countries. People here would have to prevent their own government from intervening either violently or economically. So take Cuba. Cuba broke out of the the U.S.-dominated system in 1959. Since then, it's been under constant U.S. attack, massive international terrorist attack for many years, economic strangulation, and so on. As long as the population of the United States allows that to go on, Cuba hasn't got it. They can maybe survive, but barely. It has to be blocked inside the imperial country. And unless that happens, it's going to be awfully hard, even for, the Southern Cone, if it were united, or say up to Venezuela, if it were united, to pull out of the system. There's just too many weapons on the outside. And those weapons have to be muted from within the powerful countries. That's why international solidarity is critical. And that's why things like the World Social Forum are so significant. It's really the first kind of institutionalized manifestation of international solidarity. There was support, witnesses for peace go down to El Salvador and so on, but that's on an individual level, very important, but it's kind of people-to-people interactions, but nothing organized at a large-scale level, and that's really required if countries like Brazil, and they're not the only one, are going to be able to deal with their own problems rationally. Same with Mexico.
In light of what is happening at home here in the United States, we are facing a slowing down of the economy, possibly even a depression. Then you have the Brazilian economy about to implode. You have Argentina. Then you have Mexico also facing dire consequences. Is it possible that we're going to have a kind of a collapse of Latin American economies that then will roll back the gains, the democratic and social gains of the last 25 years?
Well, it's worth bearing in mind that there has been a collapse of the Latin American economies for 20 years. There's a very striking fact about the neoliberal programs, which are roughly 20, 25 years. Just about everywhere they've been applied, there's been an economic collapse. There have been countries that developed in the last 20, 25 years, like East Asia. They didn't follow the rules. That is very striking. It's so striking that even the conservative economists are recognizing it. The Economic Commission for Latin America, which was a strong supporter of the Washington Consensus, the director, Campo, gave a talk at the American Economic Association about a year ago, in which he pointed out that what he called the promises of the neoliberal era have not been fulfilled. After a big growth period, the economies have stagnated, which means for most of the population probably declined because a sector does enrich themselves. So when you get stagnation, for most people it's declined. That's been for 20 years. He also went on to point out that that is true of every region of the world that has followed the neoliberal programs. Mm-hmm. He said they were most religiously followed in Latin America, also in sub-Saharan Africa, catastrophe. They were largely ignored in East Asia, and they had a growth period. In fact, when South Korea liberalized its finance under tremendous U.S. pressure in the early 1990s, and Thailand, they quickly had a collapse. A couple of years later, collapsed. Big surprise to the IMF and World Bank. They had to withdraw the publications that they already were distributing about the great success. And South Korea did pull out of it, but by their own measures. But the correlation is quite real. So yes, Latin America has had, it's now 20 years of basically stagnation or decline.
Economic war.
Well, no economic growth, nothing like what happened for the preceding 30 years. And that's in fact, that's worldwide. There's been a slowdown of the industrial economies too under these principles. That's not too surprising. Financial liberalization is not good for growth. There's too much rapid fluctuation and too much huge amounts of capital are put into speculation rather than in productive investment, which is no good for the economy. The other measures also are, they apparently impede growth. So little is understood about these things, you can't be sure, but at least the correlations are pretty clear. There's been a decline. In the United States, for example, the big growth period, what they sometimes call the golden age of modern capitalism, was around 1950 to 1975, before the neoliberal programs. Since then, it's been much lower growth, also highly inegalitarian growth. Through the golden age, it was egalitarian. So the lowest quintile did about the same as the highest quintile. Since 1975, it's gone like this. Equality is back to the 1920s. And since Reagan, late Carter Reagan, about the majority of the population wages have essentially, and incomes have pretty much stagnated. In fact, the last census figures, real male wages in the United States, still hadn't reached the level of 1979, despite the boom, the little boom at the end of the 1990s, which has since collapsed. So there is a kind of there are serious economic problems across the board connected with policy. And whether you can patch it together or not, it's hard to say. These are very rich countries, they can do lots of things.
Arguably, Venezuela was one of the few countries that decided not to follow this route of neoliberalism. And then we have Chavez there. And he's really, I imagine, if you're in Washington, very annoying.
Especially, they supported the coup.
Right, exactly.
Supported the coup.
I was going to ask you about the coup, which then had to be taken back. But Venezuela is very important because it's local petroleum. And why has Washington tolerated him? Why haven't they sent one of those special paratroopers and get him down?
See, I don't think they can do it anymore. Back in the 60s and early 70s, they could still manage it. But I think the population here has just changed too much. I don't think people here will support a military coup. Actually, the Reagan administration tried it. If you take a look at when the Reagan administration came in 1981, they wanted, their focus was Central America,
right.
was getting out of control. And if you look at what they did the first few months of the administration, it was almost a point-by-point copy of what Kennedy did in 1961. At first they came out with a white paper, State Department white paper about how communist Russia's taken over the hemisphere, doing this and that, all full of lies, pretty much like Kennedy's white paper when they were planning the invasion of South Vietnam. The next step was going to be, and the press, of course, repeated it. Oh God, terrible! We're going to get destroyed. But there was a popular reaction that they hadn't anticipated. From churches, from
right.
popular groups, and so on. There's just a groundswell of opposition, which there wasn't in 1961. And that was enough to make them pull back. They essentially told the press to cool it. Don't blow this up. A couple of months later, the press started exposing lies in the white paper and so on and so forth. And they pulled back. They turned to clandestine terror. I mean, clandestine is a funny word. It means everybody knows about it except the American population. I mean, the victims know about it. The international terror network, which is involved. U.S. is a powerful country, so we construct an international terror network. It's not individual terrorists, it's states. Mm-hmm. So Britain, Taiwan, Israel, Argentina, as long as it was under neo-Nazi generals, they were an international terror network which moved in and supported and financed and directed the state terror and the contra-terror, insofar as the U.S. couldn't do it itself. To a large extent, it could do it itself. And that went on, but it's called clandestine. It's not like an invasion. It's not like sending the paratroopers. Right. That's public. Yeah. And I think the same problems in Venezuela. They cannot, I doubt that the the U.S. population would tolerate a direct invasion of the traditional kind.
But isn't it likely that this war against drug lords and drug trafficking, which was this was the rhetoric in the 90s, communism is taken care of. Now the big evil is drugs. And so there was a remilitarization of foreign policy in Latin America under the guise.
It's very definitely happening.
And now terror, so we can combine the two.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening. I mean, by now, if you look at the disposition of U.S. troops in that region, the Andean region, basically, it's higher than during the Cold War. There are big military bases all over the place. There's a big one in Ecuador. There are bases in the newly established bases in the Dutch islands. There's one in El Salvador, just surrounding the region. There's American troops all over the place. The so-called drug war, which is another fraud, but let's put that aside. What's called the drug war. So, for example, the fumigation operations, chemical warfare, that's been privatized. So it's not conducted by the U.S. Air Force. It's conducted by corporations like Dyncorp, which is the U.S. Air Force, except privatized. So it's civilian pilots from the military, military officers running it, ex-military officers, but a private corporation like MPRI. They are now functioning all over the world. These are privatized offshoots of the military, which use military personnel and get all their funding from the Pentagon, but they're private. Because it's another form of keeping intervention from the population.
American paratroopers, paramilitaries.
Yeah, well then there's the paramilitaries, who in Colombia, you can trace them back to the Kennedy administration again. Back in 1962, Kennedy sent a special forces mission to Colombia, headed by a special forces general, Yarborough, and he gave a report in which he advised the Colombian military to carry out what he called paramilitary terror against known communist subversives. Mm-hmm. Well, in the Latin American context, in the context of U.S. counterinsurgency, communist subversives means, priests organizing peasants, union leaders, human rights activists, anybody who doesn't follow the rules. And the advice was, okay, carry out paramilitary terror against them. Well, it took a while before that really took shape, but by the 80s and particularly the 90s, it became a huge phenomenon. And in fact, even the State Department concedes that the paramilitaries and the military between them are responsible for a large majority of the atrocities in Colombia. Now that too has been privatized. Neoliberal principles again, like Dyncorp and MPRI. So in Colombia, if you look, the percentage of atrocities attributed to the military and the paramilitaries remains pretty constant, in the neighborhood of 75%. But the percentage attributed to the military is dropping, and the percentage attributed to the paramilitaries are going up. On the other hand, the paramilitaries are so closely linked to the military that Human Rights Watch calls them the 6th division of the Colombian army alongside the official 5 divisions. But with this privatization, you get deniability. You can, then, Clinton and now Bush and Powell can come to Congress and say, well, you know, look, Colombian military record's clean, let's send them more military aid. Yeah, it's the paramilitaries who are carrying out the atrocities. And there's been another U.S. victory, a big one, in Colombia. The war has turned the guerrillas into just another army. I mean, there was a time when the guerrillas had a kind of social program and social base, FARC, for example, particularly, but that's pretty much gone. By now, they're just another private army, and the peasants are now subjected to that army, a rampaging army from one side, and the paramilitaries from another, and the military behind them. And it's, this militarization of the conflict and undermining of the social content of the, at least guerrilla organizations, is a big achievement for the imperial power. You want to turn your enemy into terrorists. It's extremely important. Then comes the terror business. So you can, you know, you have an anti-terror campaign, an anti-drug campaign, and yeah, that's the effort. That'll be the attempt, what lies behind the very light. You know, it's not at all impossible that the next, or one of the next targets in the international intervention scheme could be the Andes. And people are talking about Syria and Iran, but the Andes is not impossible for the reasons you mentioned. It's kind of out of control. It's got very rich resources, and it's now got a network of military bases and troops that can be the basis for further intervention, and it has the pretext, drugs and terror.
Right. I understand you were recently, I read this, that you had been in Colombia, and that you have been in every major area of devastation, war, terrorism, and...
Not everyone. I went to Cauca, in southern Colombia, which actually has the worst human rights record in the country, which is saying a lot.
But I understand that you were...
I was in Medellin.
In Medellin, one of the few occasions where you actually were afraid or fearful.
I wasn't. No, the people were.
Oh, the people were.
So it's the only... I mean, I've gone to many very conflicted and dangerous areas, but I've never been in a place before where the people organizing it
are terrified.
Well, I wouldn't say they're terrified, but they were very cautious. You know, they're very brave people. They don't get terrified even if they're facing assassination. But they would not let us, there was a couple of us, one Colombian professor and one Colombian activist from the United States, Colombian woman who lives here. We went to Cauca, which is one of the worst places, and they would not let us out of the capital city. And we couldn't go visit the peasants. They had to bus peasants in to see us. Too dangerous. The only place I've been where they arranged the press conferences as I was leaving, not to protect me, but to protect themselves. You know, because they want it to be over. You know, they don't want to be there. So I wouldn't say anybody was terrified. You just face reality, and the level of violence in the country is so extreme that you can't disregard it. I mean, I was in Medellin, which is city after all. Yeah. Talked in the university, and a couple days after I left, a student was murdered right outside the hall where I was talking. And you don't even know who. By now it's urban warfare. You know, could be guerrillas, could be paramilitaries, could be gangs of one sort or another. The country has become, I mean, the number of political assassinations has about doubled in the last 2 or 3 years. It's now estimated about 20 a day. And it's all over. On the other hand, these people are incredibly brave. I mean, I spoke to somebody I knew from earlier visits, one of the priests who has been one of the heads of the human rights group in Colombia, is now living in a very conflicted and dangerous area in the countryside, big area. Actually, it's about the size of El Salvador where he's working, trying to set up peace communities. There are peasants who have tried to set up, it's been going on for some time, peace communities. They declare themselves separate from the conflict. You know, we don't want anything to do with the guerrillas or the paramilitaries or the military, just leave us alone, you know, and we won't cooperate with anyone. So you have these peace communities scattered around. It's it's very dangerous. I mean, anybody can come. The outsiders come in sometimes just for symbolic killings, just to let you know we're here. You know, take somebody, kill them in the main street, and leave. When I was there, the main one, San Jose, was under blockade by paramilitaries. It had been under blockade for about a month. Again, a priest who I know who organized, one of the leading human rights activists, Father Ronald, arranged for some people to come out. And I could talk to them in Bogota, and what they're describing is just forced starvation. They're under a blockade by paramilitaries. But they're somehow surviving. Anyhow, Francisco de Rue, the priest I was mentioning, is working in this whole area, trying to make arrangements with the militaries, with the paramilitaries who are very close to them, with the guerrillas, and just to try to allow these communities to just survive. Now, you know, to live in that environment, I don't know how you describe it, but he's not terrified. If he was terrified, he would never leave Bogota. It gets somewhere. I mean, it's building up some kind of framework of potential peace. Actually, he's being supported by a World Bank project, to their credit. Not everything they do is destructive, and this is a good, important project. And things like that are happening. On the other hand, it's extremely difficult.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think we're running out of time, and I wanted to ask you this question. I know that Bertrand Russell is someone who you admire tremendously, and in particular for his stand against the U.S. war on Vietnam. And I wonder if something like that could be organized today, something like the War Crimes Tribunal, 1966, Jean-Paul Sartre. I think you were involved with the tribunal.
I was asked to be involved, but I didn't agree.
Oh, you did not?
Not because I had any objection to it, but just because I thought it was not the right thing to do at that time. I mean, the War Crimes Tribunal in that context was, Sartre and Russell, other famous people, putting themselves in the position of judges over these events. Many good papers were given and so on, but it was not a tribunal which represented anything other than a sector of intellectual elite opinion. And that doesn't seem to me the way to organize people. And in fact, it had virtually no effect. It was just marginalized and vilified. But it didn't come out of any, if something came out of a significant popular movement and we'll make our own tribunal, okay, that's interesting. If it comes from small groups of elite international intellectuals, I don't really see a lot of point to it. It's just self-promotion. I'm not that I criticize the people, they're doing good things. But
one last question. Recently we had Richard Rorty visited Stony Brook, and he gave an interesting talk about the uncertain future of American empire. And here he laid out, in his typical fashion, these two tracks of understanding the United States. One, it's a republic, and the other one, it's an empire. And he rejects the notion that we are an empire. We are really a republic that has been very unfortunate to have fallen into the clutches of someone like Bush. Do you think we are a republic or an empire?
Well, there's a recent book by a friend of mine, a law professor. I think it's called The Imperial Republic, which goes through the legal history of the United States and shows, I think Jim Wilson, his name is, James Wilson, convincingly that it's always been an imperial republic. There's no conflict between these. I mean, republic is a kind of funny word. I mean, it's, what it is internally, we could debate, but whatever it is internally, it's been imperial from the outset. In fact, why are we sitting here? There were people here, after all, where they? From the moment the colonists landed, it was conquest. Why are we sitting on half of Mexico? Was that because Mexico cheerfully handed over half of their territory? How'd we get to Hawaii and the Philippines? Hawaii is 1898. It was just stolen from the population by guile, force, violence, taken over, and now it's part of the United States. The Philippines were conquered, a couple 100,000 people slaughtered. It's not a mistake. The interventions throughout Central America and the Caribbean, the worst of them were under the most progressive people like Wilson. It's not that you're looking the other way. This is policy. After the Second World War, when the U.S. became a world dominant state, the policies are explicit. I mean, we're a very free country. You can read this stuff. It's in the declassified record. If you want to deny the facts and bury your head in the sand, that's an option. If you want to look at the documentary and historical record, it's explicit. It's, of course, you can call it imperial or call it whatever you like, but it's a country that, from its origins, has sought to extend its domination. I mean, take, say, Cuba. It's the oldest foreign policy issue in U.S. history. It goes back to the 1820s. Mm-hmm. I mean, the founding fathers, were saying, well, we can't conquer Cuba now because the British Navy's too strong. Britain was the enemy. It was the deterrent. Prevented the colonies from conquering Canada, prevented them from, that's why there's a Canada up there. They tried, but were beaten back. They couldn't conquer Cuba, but John Quincy Adams pointed out, well, he said, we have to prevent the U.S. was opposed to the independence of the Spanish colonies. Wanted them to stay colonies, certainly not develop, and then said Cuba will fall, Adams, will fall into our hands by the laws of political gravitation as a ripe fruit. In other words, when the British become weak enough and we become strong enough, we'll grab it. Is that by accident? I mean, it was planned in the 1820s. They carried it out in 1898. As soon as Cuba did liberate itself in 1959, it was within months subjected to terrorist attack. I mean, this is accident, I mean, you really have to purposely blind yourself to a rich documentary record, which is in front of us to read, and a historical record which is completely consistent and perfectly sensible. It's exactly the way you expect powerful states to operate.
Yeah. I want to thank you for answering my questions, and I think we have now other questions from the audience.
Yeah, I'd like to return to the conversation about NAFTA, and in particular the new brainchild of the U.S., the free trade area of the Americas, which one writer described as NAFTA on steroids, I think quite accurately. And those of us in the global justice movement, just a few years ago, that was the agenda, to resist the FTAA. And we seem to be mobilizing unbelievable amounts of people, and it seemed to be very successful, but we were also suffering losses. We lost the fast track legislation. Bush got fast track. And then several things happened. 9/11 happened, Lula happened, Chavez happened, and now it's not clear. The momentum seemed almost unstoppable, the momentum towards passing this legislation. I'd just like to get your thoughts on where you think that's at now, the global justice movement and the FTAA.
Well, the FTAA is very unpopular in Latin America. I mean, from Mexico down to Argentina, there's very strong opposition to it. Opposition is not very great in the United States, but that's because you can't oppose something you never heard of. It's kept under wraps in the United States to an astonishing degree. I mean, the FTAA was supposed to be ratified at the Quebec summit. That's April 2001. There was a presidential election right before that, 2000, whatever you think about the election. One interesting fact about the election is it never came up. So it was a major issue, and if you look at the components of the FTAA, people really care about them here. People are very strongly opposed to almost all of its elements. That's why it never came up in the election. There's a sharp split between public opinion and elite opinion, where there is a consensus. There's an elite consensus. That's a wonderful thing. Public is opposed. So therefore, it does not enter the electoral arena. It is never mentioned, barely mentioned in the press. And unless people are part of the connected to the actual organizations, they just don't know about it. In fact, the level of suppression is pretty spectacular. I mean, at the Quebec summit, where this was coming up, the trade ministers, Summit of the Americas, the propaganda was all about the wonders of NAFTA and how we have to expand it to the hemisphere. Well, every editorial office in the country had on its desks 2 major studies timed for release at the Summit of the Americas by major organizations. One was Human Rights Watch, a main human rights organization in the world. The second was the Economic Policy Institute, which is a major economic policy analysis independent institute in Washington. They were both about NAFTA. They both reviewed the effects of NAFTA. Actually, I was quoting from the Economic Policy Institute one before. Human Rights Watch concluded that NAFTA was harmful for labor rights. That's what they kept to in all three countries. So it harmed labor rights, which means the rights of the majority of the population in all three countries. The Economic Policy Institute did a much more in-depth analysis of what happened to working people in the three countries. Concluded a lot of data that it harmed them in all three countries, mostly in Mexico, the most vulnerable. And they had Mexican specialists giving data. All right, here's sitting on every editorial desk in the country. Headline, Wonders of NAFTA. On your desk, 2 major studies talking about the actual effects of NAFTA. I had a friend do a database search on it. One local newspaper in the country, in Madison, mentioned it. John Nichols had a column about it. That's it for the country. I mean, you know, they're not under orders. Nobody's telling them what to publish. You just know that you do not let the population know the truth about what you're trying to ram down their throats, because it's too dangerous. You know, it's a country where people can do things, so you don't tell them. And in fact, if you did a survey, say in Stony Brook, I doubt if 5% of the population ever heard of the FTA. In Latin
America, maybe 10%. We've been working on it.
Okay.
Yes.
But you know, if you go to places which are, you know, less organized and so on, there's nobody who would have known. In Latin America, it's quite different. It's a huge issue. So here's a problem of educating people here so they understand what's being done to them. It's the same on fast track. I mean, the first time fast track was beaten back, the Wall Street Journal had an interesting article on it. It you know, lamenting the fact that fast track wasn't accepted. And it wasn't accepted because there was enormous popular opposition. I mean, people were banging on their local representatives' doors and telling them to vote against it. So they did finally, even though they all were in favor of it. What they said, the Journal said, the Wall Street Journal correctly, it said the problem is that opponents of fast track have what they called an ultimate weapon, namely the public. So you have to make sure that the weapon is sheathed, that people don't know about it. And in fact, fast track barely got through under the threat of terror, you know, which has nothing to do with, and so like fast track had nothing to do with trade either. Fast track is an attack on democracy. It's presented if it has something to do with free trade. But what it does is give the president a kind of Kremlin-style authority to negotiate trade agreements, international economic agreements in secret, and then give them to Congress, who are allowed to say yes. That's what it comes down to. But they're not allowed to discuss it or vote on it or anything like this. This is just a kind of a variant of totalitarianism. I mean, there's a sense in which it has to do with free trade. Namely, they're not going to be able to ram through their proposals, which have little to do with free trade anyhow. But whatever they are, they're not going to ram them through if there's public discussion. So you need fast track. But we shouldn't delude ourselves. I mean, that's basically what it is. It's mainly an attack on democracy. And it's true that people in the United States have to be kept ignorant of this. Latin America is much more organized and much more activist than people do know. So it's a big enterprise ahead of us.
Hi. I have 2 questions actually separate. One is, you said that a way for such countries as Cuba to survive would be for the American people to prevent their own government from attacking Cuba economically, etc. If that did happen, what would be a way to monitor the government of Cuba to prevent it from massive human rights abuses? And I'm just using Cuba here as an example because...
Do we monitor the United States to keep it from massive use?
No.
Okay.
And I'm not saying that
So
the United States doesn't...
That's up to Cubans. Well, we don't have any... I mean, yeah, we should look at it. I mean, actually, Cuban human rights violations are real. By the standards of Latin America, you know, nothing much to talk about. Like, you know, they don't have massive assassinations and so on, and they have lots of programs for the most of Latin America. In fact, virtually none of Latin America has, like health programs and educational programs, way out of any relationship to their economic level. But, you know, that's for Cubans. We can monitor it. I mean, if we think they're doing something wrong, you can say so. And you can do the same with every other country, and primarily you ought to do the same by yourself. That's the first place to start monitoring. So, in fact, if you start monitoring the United States, you discover that over many years, there happens to be an extremely close correlation between U.S. aid, including military aid, and torture. Okay, that's known to specialists in the field. Nobody else knows it. Okay, you want to start monitoring yourself. Ask, why is there a close correlation between U.S. aid and torture? And if you start looking more closely, it's a pretty ugly record. Like Colombia, which has had the worst human rights record in Latin America in the 1990s, is also the leading recipient of U.S. military aid, police aid. And it's now leader worldwide, except for Israel and Egypt, which are a separate category. It replaced Turkey in 1999. Turkey had one of the worst human rights records. It was carrying out a massive oppression of Kurds, killing tens of thousands, driving millions of people out of their homes, funded by Clinton. Clinton was providing enormous aid for these atrocities. Nobody knew about it because it wasn't reported. Turkey finally suppressed its Kurdish population. Colombia hadn't yet suppressed its peasant population. So Colombia replaced Turkey as the world leader in U.S. military aid. How many people know about this? Well, because we don't monitor ourselves. We can ask about monitoring Cuba, but there's some higher priorities.
Mm-hmm. I think we have to conclude this section. I'm sorry. I would like to conclude by thanking you for an incredible morning and afternoon and the generosity of your work and inspirational character of this work. Thank you.
Thanks.